Welcome, everyone, to the first video interview for A Busy Lady. It is a true honor to have storytelling expert John Truby with us today. Over the past 25 years, more than 50,000 people have attended John's sold-out storytelling seminars. Called the best script doctor in the movie industry, he's consulted on over 1,800 films and TV shows, including hits like Pirates of the Caribbean, X-Men, Star Wars, and Breaking Bad. His students' work has earned over $15 billion at the box office, sold more than 46 million books, among winning other major awards. John is also the author of two essential storycraft books, The Anatomy of Story and The Anatomy of Genres. He is also the creator of the best-selling software, Blockbuster. His classes are attended by everyone from Oscar winners to first-time writers. I've had the privilege of being mentored by John through the Truby Story program for many years, and I'm so grateful for everything I've learned from you, John. It is a true honor to have you here today. Welcome, and thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you, Sarah. It's a real honor to be here. I'm so happy to talk to one of the stars of the Truby Story program. The great work that you've done there has just been so impressive. So it's great to be able to talk story with you.
Thank you so much. That means a lot. John, your career has been nothing short of remarkable, and I'm sure our audience is eager to hear about your insights. So let's dive right in. What is your earliest memory of being captivated by story, and how did that interest evolve into a passion for story structure?
Well, it goes back to, this was an interesting question because I hadn't really thought about it, but it goes back to, I think, when I was 8 years old. Uh, that summer, we went down to visit my grandparents in San Antonio. And my grandmother was this very curmudgeonly old lady who took no shit from anybody. And she could make you think that she didn't want you within 10 miles of her. But for some reason, I used to, because it was so hot in San Antonio in the summer, she had this heart condition and she would have to be in bed in the afternoon. And so I would go into her room and sit under the air conditioner and talk to her. And she somehow took a liking to me, and we would have these long conversations. And she started reading. She told me about these stories that she thought were really fantastic, and turned out she read me these Greek myths, these old ancient Greek myths like Theseus and Perseus and Hercules and so on. She was probably reading from the Edith Hamilton Book of Myths, and I'd never heard this stuff before. Of course, didn't realize that she was reading me some of the greatest stories in the history of storytelling, but this stuff was just magic to me. So from then on, I was very interested and very excited about story. And what then kicked it to another level, and it was probably one of the most fortunate events of my life, and I had no idea at the time what was happening, was I was in 10th grade and we had a new teacher that year in literature, American literature. And instead of following the traditional curriculum that he was supposed to follow, he told us this theory of story that I had never heard anything like this before. I didn't realize at the time, it turned out he was telling us Northrop Frye's theory of the hero in storytelling, which is, in my opinion, the greatest insight about story that I have ever seen. And he's telling this to 10th graders. Now, this comes from Northrop Frye's book, Anatomy of Criticism, which is extremely philosophical, very dense, very hard to read, but he simplified it down for us and applied it to the various classics in American literature. And I thought the insights that he was giving us were the deepest insights I had ever thought, could even think of imagining. And it was only years later that I realized what he had done for us. So I consider that from then on, my interest in understanding story as a form of knowledge of the world was elevated to the highest level. And I've been interested in and have been doing that ever since.
I love that, especially that from your grandmother and to the teacher that inspired you as well. I feel like you do such an amazing job in class also. I've taken, in addition to the Truby Story program, your philosophy classes.
Yeah.
You're very good also at just breaking down really difficult concepts.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that is comes from that original moment of with that teacher who was able to break down this it really advanced theory of story into something that 10th graders could understand.
Right.
And it was part of it was that he had this view of education that I truly believe in, which is don't don't speak down to students. Don't don't assume that, oh, these kids are in 10th grade, so they're not going to be able to understand this stuff. Instead, go to the highest level that you can, and they will go rise to it. And it
Yes,
made all the difference in the world.
absolutely. Your insights on storytelling have shaped so many successful works. What do you think is the most overlooked or misunderstood aspect of storytelling?
I think it's the first aspect, which is the main reason writers fail to be successful. And I believe it's because they don't know the story techniques that best-selling writers use. Now, here's the problem. They think they know these techniques from reading books like Three Act and Save the Cat, Hero's Journey, and so on. But those are not professional techniques. So there's no way they're going to work to write a story that can reach the professional level. Now, in my experience, the biggest difference between the top 1% of professional writers and everybody else is the ability to create complex plot. And that's crucial because the top 1% make 90% of the sales in every medium. And what separates the top 0.1% of professional writers from everyone else is the ability to also express advanced theme. That's why I wrote Anatomy of Genres,
Yeah.
because it tells writers exactly how to express advanced theme through complex plot, which, in my opinion, is the only way that you have a shot at getting into that top 1%.
Yes, absolutely. I love how Anatomy of Genres is a book that you can read from, beginning to end, but you can also pick it up and just go through any,
Yeah.
genre. I'm always actually I have it right here.
Great.
I'm always picking it up and, looking through for inspiration as I'm working on my assignments and working on various stories.
Yeah. Great.
Um, talking about plot in conflicts, obviously, is such a big part of that in the opponent. What makes conflict compelling, and how does it enhance both plot and character?
Well, conflict is plot,
Mhm.
and it is what forces character change. And this goes back to, this philosophical idea called the dialectical method. Conflict is compelling because it adds emotion to insight. Now, here's what I mean by that. All stories tell us how to live a successful life. But if that's all they did, we could just read the great philosophers. The reason we read and see thousands of stories over the course of our life is that every life changing insight is expressed through conflict between two or more people competing for a goal. That's how stories work. That creates strong emotion, which is a much more powerful way to convey insight and make it stick than simply reading it on the intellectual level.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Because through story, I feel like we're really able to make sense of the world, right? We're able to make sense of our experiences. I know when I'm writing my stories, I really strive to write a story that the reader feels changed by it as they're going along the journey with the hero and they're, thinking about their own life or, through that experience of the story they're reading, it's changing them as well in some way.
Yes. Yeah. And the secret weapon that story has is it's not just telling us how the world works, it's doing it with an emotional impact because we get emotionally invested in those characters. And that kind of understanding is so much more powerful than simply an intellectual understanding that we would get if, for example, if the writer just expressed the theme to us in, in some kind of a sermon.
Right. No, absolutely. You really want to show it through the experience.
Yeah,
So it's like the writers or the reader is there.
yeah, exactly.
And it was nothing worse than like a movie or a book that's just dictating to you how to think,
Yeah,
like where it's just this monologue of this is how you should think. That always
yeah,
drives me crazy. I want to see the characters making tough choices and going through different experiences.
yeah. And the technical aspect of that to what you just described, which is so important, is being simply preaching the theme primarily through the dialogue. Whatever message that you want to express to the reader, it has to be done through the plot. And meaning that it is submerged, it's hidden away. It's going to have 10 times the impact that way because they know that they're just experiencing a story. They don't think that they're getting a message involved with
Right.
it, but they are. And therefore they open the door to letting that message come in. As soon as you try to preach to them through the dialogue, they shut the door and then you've lost them.
Absolutely. And really, thinking about that, the way to do that is through structure.
Yeah.
How would you advise writers? I hear this all the time when I talk, because I'm always promoting your, Truby structure and working through, letting the process do the heavy lifting and talking with other writers. But some writers will say, I feel restricted
Yeah.
by this traditional story structure method. I want to just sit down and write and see where the wind takes me and what happens. How do you advise those writers?
Well, first of all, it depends on what you mean by traditional story structure. If you mean things like three-act structure, Save the Cat, Hero's Journey, yes, they should feel restricted because those methods are for beginners only. If a writer thinks that that's all you need to get into the top 1% of writers, not to mention the top 0.1% of writers, they are in for a world of pain. You simply won't know anywhere near the number of professional techniques you need to be successful. So we need to distinguish those traditional methods of structure with what I call deep structure. Deep structure, which is based on character development through the plot, is what makes creativity possible. And that's because deep structure is based on how human beings actually solve a life problem. So when you use deep structure, you're adding your creative original take to characters the audience will recognize as themselves.
Yeah, I love how you said that deep structure really makes that creativity possible. I've definitely found that going through your class and in writing stories. I find that going through the process of structure is very painful when I'm
Yeah.
trying to break the story, when I'm trying to, get the premise right and go
Yeah.
through all the steps. And I always have a terrible time with the opponent's plan. And it could take so long. Like I feel like sometimes, it could take a year, 2 years
Yeah.
to figure out that story. But once I have that final beat list and I'm
Yeah.
writing the book, it actually does allow me to be creative because I have this like skeleton of a story that it's the most powerful that story or that initial muse or inspiration I had could possibly be. But now
Yeah.
I face, the page and I have to write scenes. I have to, you know, put in all of the narrative and describe these situations and show the characters in these situations. So even though it's there on the beat list, I feel like it still opens up creativity as I'm then writing.
Plus, not to mention the massive amount of creativity that goes into creating that beat list in the first
Yes.
place. Because
Yeah.
you say it's not just, a lot of times writers think, oh, well, I have to do this scene list. and I have to do some kind of an outline as though that's a dirty word and that's going to restrict their creativity. Well, you don't start with that.
Mhm.
We don't in the story program, we don't start with that scene list. That's one of the final things that we get to. It's all that creativity that has to do with blending originality with structure so that you've got to have that scaffolding underneath you. You've got to have some structural foundation in order for you to do something that has never been done before. And writers who are not advanced or do not understand how structure really works think that, oh, well, this is just going to prevent me from being able to come up with all these great ideas. In fact, it's just the opposite. It's what is going to make great ideas that work possible. Anybody can come up with a lot of ideas. The question is, will they work? Will they work in this story? Will they build this story properly? And only structure, again, we're talking about deep structure now, only deep structure can do that for you.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's hard work. Like I said, it's like being an archaeologist, just digging away, trying to find that gold. I know in class recently you said, the objective is to have a story that's structurally sound and unique.
Yep.
And you're really, when you're going through that process, and as you said, I feel like you're really, looking at all the possible income, all the possibilities for the story and how it might work and looking at it with that deep structure, as you said, to see right away, like this works or no, the story needs to go here.
Right.
Or what
And
if we
that's why we do that right at the premise, the very first step, because we use certain techniques that allow us to see, well, if you write the premise this way, it's going to give you certain problems that are inherent to the idea. And so that's why starting writing right from the premise, which is the foundation of the story, we have to figure out the structural elements, the deep structural elements that are inherent to that idea, most especially, as you know, the two most important parts of making a story work, which are the hero's desire line and the main opponent. And if you don't get those right from the very beginning, everything you do building on top of that will be on a foundation of sand and it won't work.
absolutely. What do you think is a common weakness that you notice in stories, and how can writers overcome it?
Well, it's both extremely simple and incredibly difficult. It's learning how to create complex plot that surprises the reader. I've found over many decades that plot is the hardest thing to teach and it's the hardest thing to learn. And it's not something you do in a moment by the seat of your pants. Writers who are pantsers, I'm sure you've heard this term before, take the fact that they don't know the vast number of professional plot techniques they need to be successful, and they turn that into a positive by saying, oh, well, what I'm doing is more creative. It's not more creative. So, how do you solve this problem of creating complex plot? Well, in my writing workshop, as you know, from having created two excellent stories there, we spend the vast majority of the time getting the plot right. And that requires a number of special techniques and exercises. And we always start by figuring out the opponent's plan. That is the key to plot. And it's something that almost no writers are even aware of that technique.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like so many writers just focus on the hero. They think
Yep.
about the hero's journey and they don't realize that the opponent is driving the hero.
Right. Absolutely right. Absolutely right. And yes, we want to be aware of the hero's journey, but that is what the reader is experiencing.
Mhm.
When you are the writer creating that journey, you have to start from what the opponent is doing to put the hero in the greatest possible trouble. And very few writers are aware of that fact. That is the key to plot. And because writers don't know that, they think, well, I'll just send the hero on a journey and then I'll have individual obstacles that the hero has to overcome. Well, that's not going to build. That is one of the great cardinal sins of plot, which is the episodic plot. You'll have individual episodes, individual scenes will stand out, but the story won't build. That's because the writer didn't start from the point of view of the opponent creating a scheme to put the hero under pressure.
Absolutely. I always struggle with the opponent's plan. And I think, and I've talked to other writers, and I think sometimes part of that struggle is that, we're rooting for the hero. We love our heroes as writers. And it's hard to put yourself sometimes, in that opponent mindset of, they're doing things to our hero that hurt them, right? Or that are stopping them from their goal. And especially when I was writing All These Threads of Time, it's a serial killer. I didn't want to think about a serial killer or
Yeah,
his plan, or, that's just so not who I am.
yeah.
But what I, realized through that process and through your classes is, exactly what you're saying is that, you know, the way that I got over it was that the, stronger the opponent, the stronger my hero will become. So the greater my hero will rise. If the opponent, is attacking the hero in smart ways, not in, ways that don't make sense or
Right.
are, you know, just something we've seen over and over in a movie before. You want to have a smart opponent and a smart plan, but the stronger that opponent is, the more that hero can rise. And that made me feel better going through it when I was coming up with, okay, this is how the opponent's attacking because this is going to make the hero greater.
Yeah. And you put your finger on one of the most important principles of story. The greater the opponent, the greater the hero will have to become to beat him. And that is, writers keep that in mind. They're 50% of the way there because it is that contest between hero and opponent that eventually leads to character change by the hero. And that's what the big payoff is that character change at the end. That is not possible unless you have a very tough opponent putting the hero under massive pressure.
Mhm. In talking about deep structure and structure, is there ever a time that a rule can be broken? Or how can a writer know if, how can they innovate the storytelling principles? If they're working through the process, is there ever a time that they can say, oh, I know usually this genre, the story beat goes this way. In a love story, we have the first dance, we have all, these different sorts of beats that carry the love story through. Is there ever a time that a writer can break a rule?
Well, you're getting to a very important concept in storytelling that trips up so many writers and it causes massive amounts of problem. I believe that innovation versus rules is a false distinction. And here's what I mean. Writers often say you have to learn the rules to break the rules. This is total nonsense. And when I hear somebody say that, I know that they have no clue about how good storytelling works, even though they think they've just given you the wisdom of the Buddha. They say, you gotta know the rules to break the rules. And that's all they say. And they sit back with a smug look on their face like they've just told you something really deep. It's nonsense. Let's, first of all, imagine we take this idea to real life. And let me give you a rule. If you step off a cliff, you will die. Now, am I going to learn that rule so I can break that rule? Of course not,
Yeah.
because there are certain rules that you always want to follow. Now, having said that, I don't use the term rules in story because it suggests a lack of creativity by definition. So instead of rule, what we really mean in story is technique. And there are a lot of techniques that are always a good idea. The one that immediately comes to mind for me is plot should always come from character. So you innovate not by following the rules or by breaking the rules, you do it by transcending them. And that gets us into genres. And let me define this for your listeners. Genres are plot systems that are made up of anywhere from 15 to 20 unique plot beats. And these have to be in your story, or you're not telling that genre properly, and then your readers will be very unhappy with you. but you can't just follow those beats. You know, here's the 15 to 20 beats. I'm going to hit those beats. No, you have to transcend them. And what that means is you have to execute them in a way we've never seen before, or do them in a different order than they're normally done. That's where the innovation comes in. And that's how you stand out from a crowd of writers who are simply following the rules of that genre. That just gets you in the ballpark of doing, say, a detective story. You got to do a detective story that nobody else is doing. And that's where the techniques of transcending the genre become so important.
Mhm. Absolutely. In Anatomy of Genres, you discuss how genres reflect fundamental aspects of the human experience. How do stories, especially genre stories, help us make sense of the world?
You want to get into some deep topics here, I see.
Yeah.
That's great. Um, well, it's very deep what you're talking about. It's very deep. We typically say that human beings tell stories, but it's much deeper than that. Human beings are stories. Because from birth, our mind creates our first story, and it is the story of me. And then everything we do in our life, we do through me as the hero, which means that everyone else is another character in my story. So for the rest of our life, everything we see and understand is a form of story. Now, I believe understanding the anatomy of story is the highest form of knowledge there is. It goes back to what we were talking about at the very beginning of our talk. When I learned these concepts of the anatomy of the hero from my teacher. Um, now, so where do genres come in? Genres are different types of stories. And therefore, each genre is, first of all, a different portal into how the world works. And second, each genre gives us a different recipe for how to live successfully in the world. So, not only understanding how the world works, but how to live well. So, let me give your listeners some examples. Horror says we live our best life when we confront our death and make amends for our sins. Memoir is not about the past, it's about creating your future. Detective fiction shows us how to think successfully by comparing different stories to learn what is true. And love stories reveal that happiness comes from mastering the moral act of loving another person. The moral act of loving another person. So, if someone wants to be a successful storyteller, they have to express that deeper life philosophy through the plot of the genre. And most writers don't do that. First of all, because they don't know how to do that. And second of all, because they don't know what the life philosophy of that particular genre is.
Right, absolutely. I think that was one of the most enlightening things for me reading Anatomy of Genres and just thinking about these genres in this different way.
Yeah.
So, for example, a horror story, I didn't realize that A Christmas Carol is actually a horror story, right?
Yeah.
Um, and, and I think that just, I love everything you're saying because even, as you go through life, not just as a writer writing stories, but I found, reading Anatomy of Genres, it's such a wonderful book, even if you're not a writer, to
Yeah.
just in understanding life and how to live life and, to sort of say you're in a hard situation, I find that I'll use techniques from the book. I'll pull myself out of the situation and say, if I were a character in a story, you
Yeah.
know,
Yeah. That's
how would
great.
this play? What
Yeah.
would this be? And it can really sort of help you see different views, differently or understand other people's perspectives a little bit better by, putting it in that sort of light.
Yeah. Yeah. And you're so right. I mean, when you're talking about the great stories and the great storytellers in history, these are brilliant people, not just in the sense of the ideas that they're expressing through this story, but through their understanding of emotional IQ. And again, that's where they give us a different set of tools for living a great life than the great philosophers give us, because they're giving us an understanding on how human emotion works between people and how to navigate that, because human emotion is always very tricky and complex and often painful. So when you put yourself, when you think about these different stories and story forms, and you say, okay, here I am in this situation now. This is the genre that I am living right now. How does a character deal with that in that genre? It can be very powerful.
Absolutely. And just sort of going back to what you were saying earlier about deep structure. Um, I often hear when I'm talking with other writers, well, how did these great historic writers write these amazing stories? They didn't have anatomy of genres or anatomy of story there to lead the way. And, for me, I'm curious your response. My response always is that deep structure was there, right? It's always been there, but now John has uncovered it for us to help guide us through, as we're writing. But what do you think about that? If we think about the great writers, a Charles Dickens, he didn't have these tools in front of him. How
Well,
did
no,
he
you're
write?
absolutely right. They weren't reading my book, and that is saying, well, here's this beat and then this beat and then this beat. No. But what they are doing is they're basing their understanding of story on all the stories they read, and they form a certain, some of as these great writers, they have a deep understanding of how great story works. They also, depending on the type of story they're telling, they are also have tremendous experience in that genre, even though somebody didn't pull out those beats for them and say this comes after this, which comes after that. They 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 I often find with really good writers, they won't necessarily consciously understand what those beats are, but they have a very powerful understanding of what the beats are and how they will work in their story. They're just masters of the story mind. And that what I tried to do was simply to say, to have a chance to write professionally, not to mention writing a great story, but to have a chance to write professionally, it'll be very helpful for writers to be able to consciously pull these beats out and know, well, this is what, we may not all be Charles Dickens and have a natural sense of how that, because what he was doing was actually a very interesting combination. He was doing a combination of myth plus personal drama. Those are on two opposite ends of the genre spectrum. So, I mean, or take somebody like Edgar Allan Poe. This guy is incredibly important in the history of story. He created the detective story, and he is considered to be the father of the modern horror story.
Yes.
I mean, that's some pretty powerful accomplishment. But in that sense, he literally did create a form of story, and because he worked out those beats, we've been building on that ever since. And every detective writer after that, you'd be amazed at the number of beats that are in his original detective stories that are still found in modern detective stories.
Yeah.
And it's just that's how great, or take another person, Mary Shelley, unbelievably important person in the history of storytelling. She basically created both the modern horror, the more modern transcendent horror story, and the science fiction story.
Yes.
So it's like we're not all born with that kind of natural talent to understand how to tell a great story or even create a new type of story, a new type of genre. But we can certainly benefit from the knowledge that they've given us.
Absolutely. And they gave us so many, I mean, just perfect stories
Yeah.
that are just amazing. Um, So I tour a lot of different historic author homes in the area. There's so many here in New England where I live, and
Yeah,
it's always just so amazing to learn about their lives and,
yeah,
you know, walk where they walked and sit, at their desk of where they sat and just, everything you're describing, about Edgar Allan Poe and coming up with these new, the detective story and Mary Shelley. It's so awe-inspiring.
yeah. It is. I just when I see when I when I was writing the anatomy of genres and I'd look to see it allowed me to focus on what did particular writers actually do. And a guy like Poe, who we think of as, he would tell these, he had a lot of these little short stories, they're very powerful and so on. But he was like a short story writer in the 1840s. Well,
Right.
no, he was a lot more than that. He was a massive figure in the history of story worldwide. And it wasn't until I started writing this book, Anatomy of Genres, that I realized just how great he and people like Mary Shelley, Dickens, and so on. Dickens is essentially the father of modern television,
Yeah.
with the serial story structure. I mean, it just when you understand and what you would call it, A Christmas Carol, probably the most influential Christian story other than the story of Christ in the history of story. I mean, I when I would watch A Christmas Story, it would be just, oh, this is a little fun horror story, fantasy story. And, I didn't realize the entire Hallmark channel is
It's based
based
off of
on A Christmas Carol.
it.
No matter what time of year they're doing a story, they're using A Christmas Carol beats almost line for line.
Absolutely. I never thought about that, but that's so true.
Yeah. Yep.
So thinking about narrative, just taking a sort of shift to narrative, what
Yeah.
techniques can writers use to make their narratives more memorable? And does it matter if you have a strong structure? So I
Well, it
guess,
does. It does matter because you do it by combining structure and originality. And
Mhm.
again, that takes us to transcending the genre, which is that combination. You can't have a great story with just one. You've got to have the structure and the originality. And again, what you do is you have to hit the beats that make the story enjoyable and why it's that particular genre. But you want to do them in such a way that no one has ever seen that done before. And the effect on the reader is they get to have their cake and eat it too.
Mhm.
And this is how also to a larger issue of taking writing to the professional level, this is how you create your story brand. Because then the readers have to come to you to get what you write because you're the only one writing it.
Right.
You cannot make money as a writer if you are doing what everyone else is doing.
Mhm.
Why would they pay you money for that? You can only make money as a writer and make it a viable business for you if you are writing something that they can only come to you to get that. And take your book, the all these threads in time. Um, it is based on the thriller genre, but it is a very unique take on the thriller genre, bringing in some science fiction elements and weaving it in a seamless line. So we're not, we're reading that. We're not thinking, oh, this is a thriller with science fiction elements. That's interesting. I haven't seen that before. No, it has the strong foundational structure, but then the original elements make us go, wow, I've never seen this before. This is really a cool story. It's without both of those, you do not have a winner.
Yeah, no, I agree. It sounds funny. It's my story. But yeah, and that was the most challenging part of writing it, right? Was bringing in those science fiction elements of the time travel
Yeah,
because as you know, writing a detective is one of the hardest stories to write because we have to hide the opponent
yeah,
and we don't want to give anything away. And then adding that time travel with it, it was like every single time that she time traveled, it could offset something. So
yeah,
I sort of had those two, threads, no pun intended, that I had to follow of the thriller line and having those solid time travel rules. But then,
Yeah.
everything you're talking about too, as far as transcending and anatomy of genres, putting that emotion into it. Because
Yeah.
for me, the story started with an emotion. It started with this, vision of a family facing extreme grief and
Yeah.
trauma and how they could overcome that in some way.
Yeah.
And, fitting it into that story to tell it seamlessly was definitely a challenge.
And that I think it really comes through because you get from the point of view of the thriller. Thriller oftentimes highlights a single character who's in trouble, who is under pressure. They don't know who the opponent really is, trying to kill them, things like that. Um, what was really very powerful to me in that story is that you started with the personal ramifications of the death of this girl and the devastation, the collateral damage on the family. And then that becomes the motivation for the investigation. So it's not just, oh, well, wouldn't it be interesting? I'm a detective to investigate this crime and see if I can find out who the killer is. That's intellectual. No, this was coming from the emotional point of view. And that's also why I think the ending is so powerful. That ending is just a knockout ending because of the emotional connection with the family. And that's why I'm talking about putting so much emphasis on you've got to know your structures. You've got to know your genre structure, especially when you're combining genres like that. But you've got to also remember what the fundamental purpose of story is, which is to express emotion through characters. And the combination of those is what made that such a great book.
Thank you. I mean, in all honesty, everything that I learned in class was so amazing and really carried me through. I mean, it was definitely at least over a year that, trying to break that story and trying to get that solid line so that all those things could shine through. You
Yeah,
know, as a writer, sometimes you have the vision, but when you sit down and you're trying to do that deep structure work, it's so hard to dig for it and
yeah.
to really help the story shine in its best light.
Well, that's the work that, I sometimes eh, use the analogy of sports for being a fiction writer. If you wanted to be a professional athlete, for example, a professional basketball player, that takes years of coaching, years of hard work, years of practice. And what are you practicing? You're practicing the techniques. You can't just shoot a 3-point shot in basketball just because you see the basket over there and you're going to move your arm. No, there's very specific techniques of shooting a basketball that you have to learn and you have to practice over many, many years. The same is true, if not more so, in fiction writing, in storytelling. And it's just that writers often think, well, I learned to write in school. So I must therefore be able to tell a story. I watch television. I can do that too. Well, maybe you can, but you're not even aware of all the techniques that that writer had to master in order to put that story in front of your eyes and do it at the professional level. That's why I say we're talking about the top 1% because those are the people that have mastered all the skills, all the techniques, and know how to put it into a single story that seems seamless. Like, to use an analogy, Michael Jordan was probably a little bit ahead of the time of most of your listeners, but this guy looked like he would just fly.
Mhm.
Well, guess what? That was based on technique. It wasn't just that he has really good legs. Um,
Mhm.
you know, you've got to have, in order to make it look in order to make it look like you're not working very hard, that you're doing it naturally or with style. There's a tremendous amount of technique under the surface that the viewer cannot see, but you have got to master it in order to be able to pull that off.
Mhm. Exactly. And it takes such tenacity to do that. I think that's where a lot of writers sometimes give up because it's such hard work and it doesn't feel good when you're going through that process and you're trying to master those techniques and break a story and work through it. Um, it's hard work, you know?
Or work, and that's why, when I hear people say, well, I just kind of do it by flow, or I just do it how I feel. I'll let the characters do what they want to do, this kind of stuff. I think you got no shot. You just have no clue what is really involved in great storytelling if you think that way, because what it really is they don't want to put in the hard work that's required to master those skills. If you're going to do it better than 99% of everybody else writing stories, you're going to have some very high level skills. You're not going to just do that because you got inspired one day.
Right, exactly. Which this does bring me to my next question. So, as technology, especially AI, continues to evolve, how do you see storytelling maintaining its artistic integrity in this changing landscape?
Well, again, we go back to that combination we've been talking about, which is mastery plus originality. AI is by definition generic.
Mhm.
So for many writers using AI, they will get a little better at the beginning,
Mhm.
guaranteed. But then their improvement will stop because they have simply gotten themselves to the average level. That is
Mhm.
what AI will give you. It is the average level. And that means that no one will read their work because that's what everyone else is writing. So I believe, if you're going to use AI, you're making a deal with the devil. And it will guarantee that you will never get to the level of mastery you need in order to stand above the crowd.
Mhm.
Again, and this is something I've said many times now, we have to get into the top 1%. And to do that, you have to master the genre. Not just know it, not just I watch a lot on TV. No, I have to master that genre. And that means transcending it, doing that genre in an original way. And AI will never be able to do that. By definition, it will not do that. It'll do the genre, but it won't do it in an original way. And that therefore you have no chance to stand above the crowd and say, hey, look how great I am, and actually be able to prove that.
Right. And I worry too that you lose the emotion of the story,
Oh yeah,
right? As well.
totally. This again, these are skills of expressing emotion through form,
Mhm.
expressing emotion through technique, that just because it knows the beats of a story doesn't mean that that's going to express the emotion. That is a whole level of skill that a machine cannot do and will never do.
Mhm.
And what my fear is that the writers will try it and they'll say, "Oh, well, that made things easier." Yeah,
Right.
I did. It helped me come up with an idea for a character. Okay, so I'll use more. Well, now this time I'm going to do it for premise, and well, that was helpful. So now I'm going to do it for plot, and it slowly but surely it's going to encroach on your process and mean that nothing you do is original at all. It's just whatever they fed you, whatever AI
Right.
fed you. And so
Right.
it's like a drug. I'm going to get hooked on it. And because really great writing is such hard work, boy, I don't want to work that hard. You know,
Right.
if I
Yes.
can just have AI do it for me. But the problem is the result is not something that is going to get you where you want to go, which is to set yourself above the crowd.
Exactly. And it really steals that opportunity for you as a writer to grow and to learn, to hone
Yeah.
those.
Exactly. You have no chance at mastery. You have no chance of getting to that level of skill that is required to be able to do it on your own.
You often say, let the process do the heavy heavy lifting. What is the hardest story that you've ever worked on, and how did you push through it?
This is a really good question. It made me really have to go back over a lot of years and think of a lot of different projects. And I have to say that one of the most challenging ones, but also one of the most rewarding, was when I was hired to help the Blue Man Group writers turn their show into a film treatment. And the challenge here was to convert the Blue Man theatrical experience into film, which of
Mhm.
course is a very different story medium. And that meant that it would lose the live qualities that made Blue Man a worldwide hit. So that's a big challenge. So what I'd like to do is just go through the process that we used in that and
Okay.
be fairly detailed about it because I want your listeners to understand how detailed a professional writing process really is. And since I think most of your listeners will be familiar with the Blue Man Group show, they'll understand the techniques that we used to try to turn it from show into film. So, step one was determine the main genre embedded in the Blue Man concept. There is already a genre embedded in the Blue Man idea. And it turns out it was a traveling angel comedy, which is one of the subforms of comedy. The second step, determine any secondary genres that are also involved. Well, the secondary genre was fantasy. Third, identify the techniques which are essential to how the Blue Man experience operates. Let me give you some examples of things that we came up with. The butterfly principle, the use of paint and color, the drumming, the buzzing, what I call the buzzing household technique, etc. There are a whole ton of them that they have. Step four, differentiate the three Blue Man characters who have no face or voice.
Right.
That
Yeah.
was really
The
hard.
challenge.
That was the biggest challenge right there. But if we don't crack that challenge, we have nothing. Um, Step five, create the Blue Man story world in the real world. So, in other words, out of that theatrical setting, which is inherently a fake world that we're entering, we need to, in film, we need to turn that into a real world setting. Step six, create the storyline possibilities within the traveling angel genre. So within the main genre that we're using, what are some of the different storylines we could play with? Step seven, create the main human characters. These are the characters that the Blue Man characters will help. That's basic to a traveling angel story. Step eight, create the outside opponent and the main threat to the building where the main characters live. So we have to get our main opponent first, right? Then the next step was create the inside opponent within the characters in the building. Who is going to be a secondary opponent there? Step 10, figure out the endpoint. We'll always have to figure out the endpoint early on so that we know where we're focusing the storyline and all these story events toward. Step 11, determine the story beats of the entire story. And notice all the way steps 1 through 10 are all the structural work that we're doing to make the story beats, the actual story beats that we then come up with, work and sequence properly and express the genre that we're working in. And once we did all of that, then we had to write the treatment.
Yeah.
And we produced all of that in 1 week. And I,
Wow.
and I have to say,
Oh
I
my
thought it
goodness.
was great. I
Yeah.
thought it was great. And even better, they thought it was great as well. Unfortunately, and here's the catch, once Blue Man Group was purchased by Cirque du Soleil, they determined they would not be spending money to develop a film. And of course,
Oh,
that's part of the game. That's where the business part comes in. They just did not want to spend that money for I don't know what reason was, other than just we don't want to. It's going to be cost us a lot of money, but
yeah.
it may be that they also didn't want a film version of the show because they thought it might cut into the show. This is a worldwide phenomenon, right?
Yes.
Whatever reason they decided not to do it, but it would have made one hell of a movie.
It sounds like I was gonna say I've not seen the movie or heard of it. I need to see it.
Well, most of the work that I do, that's the downside of it, which
Yeah.
is when I consult on a story or a script, most of them do not end up getting made.
Mhm.
And it's because the cost involved, especially in film, and the percentage of stories in films that are actually successful versus the vast majority of them which are not successful at the box office. Um, there's all kinds of reasons that it gets tabled before it ever goes to film. Um,
Right.
but this was one of the most painful because it would have been great. It really would. I
Yes,
mean,
it sounds
The Blue Man Group is such a fun show. It's such a great show. But to do that on film with real characters in a real
yes.
setting, oh my God, it would have been fantastic. But that's the way the game is played.
Oh, and I love the traveling angel
Yeah.
concept that you were using with it. That would have been fantastic.
Yeah, it would have been and interesting enough, I've never seen a traveling angel comedy fail. They're
Right?
always successful. Audiences love them. And they would have loved these three Blue Man guys being
Mhm.
traveling angels. It would have been fantastic. But
But,
that's the way it goes.
oh man. So who are your favorite authors or filmmakers, and how have they influenced your work?
Well, first of all, I believe that the screenwriter is the author of the film, not the director. So I put tremendous emphasis on the writer of the film. And it's similar to the emphasis that we put on the writer, the creator, the showrunner, and TV show. I believe they're the same thing. So I'm maybe the only guy in the world that does this, but I consider the writer the author, not the director. That said, the two films that had the most influence on me in terms of seeing the potential of storytelling in film was Seven Samurai and McCabe and Mrs. Miller. Um, And I really got involved in storytelling, story consulting, basically what I do um, from seeing those two films. And if you broke them down in terms of their structure and the plot and so on, they're not altogether dissimilar in this, one is an anti-Western, the other is a samurai movie, but they're in terms of the themes, the story, the genre, uh, and the idea of, they're both about the end of an era, the end of showing through film how these characters are caught in a larger social transformation that they don't have any clue how to solve it. You could put into that category Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid as well. That's what a classic anti-Western is about. But that had tremendous power to me at the time. I was a teenager at that time. Um, More recently, I'm a huge fan of Martin McDonagh, who is the writer director of In Bruges. I think he's one of the best out there, and In Bruges is just a mind-blowing film. Um, Now, because I feel that the best storytelling in the world is in television, which is controlled by writers, my favorite writers include Stephen Knight, who created Peaky Blinders, Vince Gilligan of Breaking Bad, and Matt Weiner of Mad Men. To me,
Yes.
these are some of the greatest storytellers in the world. And when I look to the craft of story, regardless of medium, and I want to look at what I consider are the very best and learn from them, those are the guys that I go to,
Yeah.
and
Break-
other writers in television like them.
yes. Breaking Bad was a masterpiece. I mean, it was just
Yeah. Yeah. I
like,
consider it one of the five greatest TV shows ever made. Along with Mad Men is in that five as well.
yes.
But those, I mean, the amount of quality and talent that goes into not just one episode, but multiple episodes in a season and then multiple seasons. The fact that they're able to maintain this absolutely brilliant level of storytelling week in, week out,
Yeah.
year in, year out, it just blows my mind. How can they possibly be that great? But they
Yeah.
are. But there's not many of them.
It's true. I mean, especially to do that for that amount of time without being episodic.
Yes. Yeah,
That's a
exactly.
huge, I mean, as we were talking earlier about honing your skills and, coming to that level, they certainly had those skills behind them to do that.
exactly. And again, they're founding all of that ability to do shows that are not episodic in the old sense of the term, meaning it used to be like in the old shows in the 70s and 80s on network, they were literally episodic, meaning
Yes.
there was a detective story, it'd be a new crime each week, news and a solution. Then next week, another crime, another solution. There's no building of the season. But this is serial television. This is serial story structure, which means, yeah, you want a great episode, but those episodes have got to connect and build to a great season finale.
Yeah.
And that level, that's like 10 times harder because you're trying to link all these together. So, the fact that they can do this um, over multiple seasons of excellence is just, again, I don't see anybody who I put in that category.
You know when it's really good too, when you can watch it, after studying with you. I'll often watch things and I'll start pointing out things, I'll see the structure. But when I can just enjoy it and say, wow, it was so good. And then I want to go back and rewatch it to then study the structure, you know that they did an amazing job.
Absolutely. And I'm the same way. When I watch something really good, I don't apply structure at all. I'm just totally wrapped up in it. It's when it goes bad that I'm kicked out of the story, and I say, why did that just happen? And then
Right.
then my critical mind kicks in, and then they've lost me for the rest of the story. But yeah, when it's really good, there's no, as much structure knowledge as you have that you could apply, you're not applying any of it. You're just totally sucked in.
Exactly. You're just along for the ride.
Yep. Absolutely. Absolutely.
What trends do you think are shaping the future of storytelling? Are there any new or unexplored story types or structures that you're particularly excited about or that you would like to see?
Well, another great question. We're definitely moving toward what I think of is the complete interconnection of life and story. And that's one of the reasons why I wrote The Anatomy of Genres. And I believe that's a very good thing. Because the more that story informs our lives, the more we can make the life we want to live. We can, in other words, use story to act in a proactive way to actually improve our own lives. And we're moving toward what I call the storification of the world. And I believe that this future of story is already here in that sense. It's because I think that story is our worldwide religion. It's the guide to how to live a good life, regardless of what culture you come from. Now, as to the story forms that I'm most excited about coming up, the biggest revolution in story right now is the reemergence of the female myth. Now, you know this, we've talked about this before in the story program, but female myth has been gone from Western culture for about 3,000 years.
Wow.
But just in the last 10 years, that's how recent it is. In the last 10 to 15 years, it's come back strong. And in the myth chapter of the book, I talk about the difference between the male myth and the female myth. And I explain that what we have typically thought of as myth was actually the male warrior myth, a very specific kind of myth. It is not myth, it is not a monomyth at all. And I explain why I think that this female myth and different versions of it, there's no one female myth, will be a major form in worldwide storytelling for decades to come. I, as you know, I teach all over the world. Um, there is no subject that writers are more excited about than when I talk about the emergence of the female myth, because the potential for that and the popularity that is going to engender, I think, is just overwhelming. We are right at the very beginning of this thing. And so I always recommend that writers, if you're at all interested in the themes that the female myth expresses, then start to study this form and see if you can write something in that form because the excitement about it is, I think, is already overwhelming. And even though most people, viewers don't say, "Oh, look at that new female myth there," but what it's telling him is so new and so refreshing, and so contrary to the male warrior myth, which I think is super destructive for the world now.
Right.
I think that's why people are so excited about the potential of what it is going to be in storytelling and the effect that it possibly could have.
Mhm. What are there any modern female myths or other female myths that you would suggest looking at or studying to really?
Well, the films that have really started this trend, this phenomenon, what began it was Avatar,
Mhm.
because Avatar is not a female myth, but it's a story about the move from male myth to female myth in the same story. And that's why it's an extremely important story. We typically think of it as a popcorn movie of basically a big big blue people and doing classic warrior type things. No, it's much deeper than that, and it's a move away from the male warrior approach to the female myth approach. Other examples of it are Gravity. um, Arrival is a great example of female myth. And we see it, I think, and we will continue to see it most importantly is in television. Um, Sex and the City was a female myth,
Mhm.
and the revolutionary in terms of television, that show. Um, whatchamacallit, the one, Fleabag.
Mhm.
Fleabag is female myth. Um, and the it's because obviously television, yes, a film, if it breaks through, can have a tremendous viewership worldwide, but it pales in comparison to the power of a television show,
Right.
in terms of the number of people that watch it and get affected by it and continue to be affected by it week after week, year after year, if it's successful. So that's why I think that's where we'll start to see most of these female myth stories. But in both mediums, it's going to be massive.
That's so exciting. I'm gonna start studying female myth.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah.
Um, what advice would you give to a writer who is struggling with self-doubt or feeling stuck on their creative journey?
Well, first of all, I'd say, well, that's the norm.
Mhm.
Everyone has imposter syndrome. I often hear writers, I've been writing for a while and I still have imposter syndrome. Well, guess what? You're going to have it your whole life. That's
Mhm.
how it works, right? And I always tell them, courage is not the absence of fear, it's the ability to push through the fear to get the job done.
Mhm.
Now, the difference in a creative task is that it depends almost entirely on technique.
Mhm.
So if you're stuck in a story, it's not because you suddenly have a psychological obstacle holding you back. It's because you've run into a structural problem that you have to solve. And you can only do that by applying the right technique. And that leads to the next point, which is, and I always tell writers this, always be training. Remember in sales, they always say ABC, always be closing. Well,
Yes.
this is always be training, because the process will do the heavy lifting. But you have to know the process, you have to work the process, and it has to be, as I was pointing out with Blue Man, it has to be a detailed enough process to be able to make sure that all the structural elements are present and weaving together. So if you have the if you have a process that you can use, that's what will get you through these dark times, these times when you run into a block, you don't know what it is. Well, go back to the process, go through the steps, and go through the techniques that you need to use to break through that obstacle. Without that process, I believe that a writer can never be good. With it, I believe there is no limit to how good they can be. And as proof of that, what we're talking about here, I would have your listeners just look at you because you worked that process on now two books, and it was a tough process. It was a lot of hard work. There were a lot of times when you ran to blocks and obstacles, but you kept working the process, and eventually you broke through those, and the result was phenomenal. So that's what I would tell any writer is don't be the prisoner of the moment. Look, take the long view, realize it's going to take a lot of work. You're going to run into obstacles at various times, but if you work your process, you can solve those obstacles, and the result will be more than worth the effort.
Yes, I mean, the process definitely carries you through. I feel like without it, you're just swimming in the ocean or drowning in the ocean rather. It's just going back to the tools that you have and trying to work through it. And in each story, I think we've talked about this in class too, like it never gets easier.
Yeah.
It's,
Yeah.
I thought when I did all these Threads of Time, I thought, oh, wow, I figured out that story. This is great. The next one's going to be so easy. And then it was, in many ways, I felt like just I was starting over again. I mean, in the sense I did have tools under my belt
Yeah.
from everything I've learned, but it is still a different story. And you're challenging yourself as a writer to come to a different level. And it's just, you know, like you said, that process. And, as a writer, for me anyway, sometimes I'll have, like the muse or the inspiration for a story.
Yeah.
And it's hard, though, to dig for that deep structure, to
Yeah.
really mold it into the best story that it can be.
Yeah. Well, I was saying at the beginning of answering that question, everybody has imposter syndrome and they will always have it. Similarly, everybody has these moments when they think, this is a new story. I don't know how to break this one. I don't know how to crack this code. It never gets easier. The level that you are doing it goes higher, but you're only experiencing it in the moment. So you're just experiencing the pain that you're going through and trying to figure out this particular story. But keep in mind, every story is a complete collection of new collection of characters, a new entire story world, and you are God each time. But creating an entire world of characters that will then go through various interwoven actions, that's always going to be complicated. And no, I
Yes.
don't care how good at it you become, it's
Mhm.
always going to be tough. And you just have to have the psychological toughness and resilience to say, this is how it works. And
Mhm.
it's always going to be this way. And I just have to keep my eye on the prize and
Mhm.
say, this is going to be worth it if I just work my process.
Exactly. And the process is there. It's like a guide to guide you through because there's so many things you're thinking about. You're thinking about emotions and the psychological impacts on the characters. And, if you're doing a detective, for example, you have to think about, different research of, how clues could be discovered or unique ways they could be discovered. There's just a lot going on, at least for
Yeah,
me in the brain.
exactly.
I'm trying
Always.
to figure out.
Absolutely.
But the process really it guides you through, like
Yeah.
you said.
It will always be there for you and it'll always save you.
If you could only reread three books for the rest of your life, what would they be and why?
This is another really good question that made me think, and I resisted answering the way I'm going to answer, but then I realized no, this is what I would do. The first two books would be Anatomy of Story, Anatomy of Genre.
Mhm.
And here's the thing: it's not because I wrote them; it's because they're about story. And as we've spoken before, knowledge of story is, I believe, the greatest wisdom there is. And I want to tell you a little story that is relevant to this. I recently went to Paris for the publication of the French translation of Anatomy of Genres. And I was going to be interviewed a number of times over there. So I thought, it's been a couple of years since I wrote it. So I want to read it again and just refresh. And I had this very strange sensation. I would read a line and think, wow, that's really smart, you know? And of course, you expect to come up with a smart insight every once in a while, but I was thinking that after every single line. And I
Mhm.
thought, I couldn't have written that. There's no way that came out of my head one after another. But here's the thing that I realized it wasn't because I wrote it, it was because there's nothing more mind blowing than the wisdom of story. And I was just riding the wave of that. And
Right.
that's why it was such a thrill. Yeah, I have my name on those books, but to be able to ride the wave of story wisdom, to me, that's if there are only three books that I could read from, that would keep me busy for quite a while, even though I wrote them.
Would.
Yeah.
Yes. What would be your third?
Well, that I couldn't come up with. I was trying to think of, well, there's got to be a novel
Mhm.
that I would love to read again and again. But I really couldn't think of one because then I thought, well, but there'd be this one and there would be that one. And, there's this love story that I really like. And, and, part of the problem with it being a novel is that plot is so important to a story that when you've read the story and you know what those plot things are, then that element of pleasure that's part of the overall pleasure
Right.
of the book is stripped away. And then so I don't know that I would that it would be a novel. You could say, well, what about, War and Peace or, something really long like that. But there was nothing that really jumped out as probably going with the theme that we've been talking about. Um, the third thing that I came up with was Northrop Frye's Anatomy of Criticism, which had such a
Right.
and it's such a dense book that even if you reread it a few times, it's really slow reading. It's just the amount of power in that is just intellectual power in that is just overwhelming. So that I would, although I might uh, grow tired of reading all these books about story after a while, but anyway, and that's a book that I would recommend to your listeners with the caveat that it's very dense, it's very philosophical, um, and it's you have to make the connections between the theoretical and the practical of writing your story. But it's just his theory of there are four parts of the book. The first part is on the theory of the hero, but that it's so influential. It's so massive in terms of when you read this stuff, you suddenly go, "Oh my God, now it all makes sense." I get how all these, not how that's just how that story works, but how all those stories link together in the history of storytelling. And
Yeah.
again, that just blew my mind.
Well, I would definitely have Anatomy of Genres and Anatomy of Story as my my
Oh,
two that I
good,
reread as well.
good,
And
good
I
to
do
hear.
reread them. I reread them all the time. In
Yeah,
fact, my son, he loves story, and he's probably been so greatly influenced, listening to me talk about your classes all the time, that
yeah,
he's was stealing. He's 14 now, but he's been reading your book since he was 11. And I
good.
had to buy him his own copies because he he kept having them all the time.
I tell you that I love hearing that because if I can't tell you how helpful getting that Northrop Frye's theory of hero in the 10th grade was for me for the rest of high school and college. Because
Yes.
when you have that, any literature class you take,
Mhm.
you are so advanced, far advanced from everyone else in the class just having that as a foundation knowledge. And I hope that for your son that will be the case for those two books as well. If he reads them and especially if he rereads them, the amount of power that he's going to be coming with when he goes into his high school and college career is just going to be huge, huge.
Absolutely. I mean, I see it now. I often talk with him about story,
That's great. That's great.
to have someone to, in the house to bounce
Yeah,
ideas off.
that
And
must be fun. That must be a lot of fun.
it is. So, John, we're going to start wrapping up, but is there anything that you'd like to add?
The last thing I would want to leave with writers is that you are the bringers of wisdom. And that means that you have a tremendous moral responsibility. I believe if you can express your life philosophy in your story without preaching to the reader, in other words, by doing it through the genres, by doing it through the plot beats, I believe you have a chance to change the world and have a great career for yourself in the process. And to me, that dual intention is what every writer should be striving for. That is, yes, we want to be a professional. We want to get into that top 1%. We ideally would love to make a living and a good living through our writing, through our work. But at the same time, I believe that the moral responsibility means that we have to at least try in whatever way we see as a positive effect on the world, we need to try to express that as well. So I think if writers can go with that dual intention, they also each help each other, because if you have that kind of idealism in terms of trying to change the world with what you write, it can sustain you also through the tough times when you're trying to just make a
Yeah.
physical living, actually make a career out of this, because it is so hard to do.
That's so well said. And I really do believe stories have the power to change the world.
Yeah, I agree. I
I
agree. We've seen it so many times. And it's just the amount of positive effect that you can have on thousands, sometimes millions of other people is just overwhelming. And to me, that to be able to do that, it's hard to do, but if you can do it, it's about as great as it gets.
Absolutely. Well, John, thank you so much for joining me today. You are absolutely incredible. You've been an incredible mentor to me, and it's just truly such a pleasure to have you here to share your wisdom. I know that your guidance has absolutely shaped me, not just in my storytelling, but in my life and you know, living my best life. And I know that you've inspired so many others and so many writers, and I'm sure that all of our viewers here today will leave inspired. If our viewers want to find you, how can they discover your work?
Best is just go to truby.com,
Okay.
truby.com. Yeah.
Okay.
And there's all kinds of ways that you can, whatever your particular interest might be, that then I've probably over the last few decades, I've talked about it in some way or another. But Sarah, thank you so much. It's been an honor and a thrill to come here and talk story with you. As one of the stars of the story program, it's been so gratifying to see the success that you have had and continue to have. And it just, for somebody who is trying to get these techniques out to writers in the world, to see you grab them and really run with that and just write such great stories is just been a thrill for me as well. So thanks again.
Of course. Thank you. And to everyone watching, keep writing, keep dreaming, and see you next time.